the most powerful military on Earth, once marked Australia's elite soldiers on its command map with a cutout photograph of a television crocodile hunter. Not a flag. Not a tactical symbol. A cartoon celebrity. That image alone tells you everything about what the United States thought of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in the opening months of the Afghanistan War, and it tells you nothing about what was about to happen next. How does a force small enough to fit in a single aircraft hangar outmaneuver, outthink, and outlast the largest special operations machine in human history? Why did American commanders nearly send the Australians home? And what single moment made them beg them to stay? And what does a battered military radio, carried through the Hindu Kush on a soldier's back while everyone else had dropped, theirs, have to do with the most important intelligence breakthrough of the entire Afghan campaign? Stay until the end. Because what happened in the mountains above the Shah-i-Kot Valley in March 2002 didn't just change a single battle. It changed the way the world's most powerful nation thought about special operations warfare, and it was done by a handful of men who carried their radios while everyone else was running. The night comes fast in the Hindu Kush. One moment the sky is the color of old brass, the western ridgelines catching the last breath of dying light. The next moment, darkness. Complete, suffocating, absolute darkness. No gradual descent, no warning. The mountains simply switch off the sun and leave you with a cold that arrives like a fist, straight through the layers, straight through training, straight through experience, straight into something older and more animal than any of those things. In the early weeks of December 2001, a small group of men moved through that darkness in silence. They moved low. They moved slowly. They moved with a kind of patience that cannot be taught in a few months of training, but must be earned over years of failure, refinement, and the grinding repetition of learning to think like the terrain rather than against it. They were Australians. They were operators of the Special Air Service Regiment, known to their own people as the SASR, and they were entering a country that the rest of the world had not yet begun to understand. They arrived through Forward Operating Base Rhino. The name sounded formidable. The reality was a former drug smuggling hub baked into the desert southwest of Kandahar, a flat and merciless expanse of hardpan earth and dust where the wind carried the smell of something ancient and broken. This was not a glamorous entry point. There were no cheering crowds. There were no briefings under bright lights with laser pointers and colored maps. There was the desert and the dark and the work to be done. And behind them, already moving into position on the heavy modified frames of Australian-built Land Rover Parenties, were the vehicles that would define their campaign. While other coalition special forces competed for American trucks, American helicopters, and American logistics chains, the Australians had arrived with their own. It was a decision that seemed unremarkable at the time. It would prove to be the most tactically important choice the task force made. Self-sufficiency in a war where everything was scarce meant freedom. Freedom meant range. Range meant the ability to go places no one else could reach and stay there long after everyone else had gone home. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the Australian Special Air Service Regiment actually was. Not what it looked like on paper. Not the formal description in a defense white paper. What it actually was, in its bones, in its history, in the specific and particular tradition it carried into those mountains. The regiment was founded in 1957, modeled directly on the British Special Air Service that David Stirling had built in the deserts of North Africa during the Second World War. The same philosophy, the same doctrine, the smallest viable unit, 4 to 6 men, operating beyond the reach of conventional support, living off the land, gathering intelligence, striking when least expected, and vanishing before the enemy could respond. This philosophy was simple and brutal in equal measure. Send the fewest men. Give them the most freedom. Expect the impossible. Trust them to deliver it. But it was in Vietnam that the SASR forged the specific identity that it carried into Afghanistan. Between 1966 and 1971, SASR squadrons conducted more than 1,200 patrols through the dense jungle of Phuoc Thu province in South Vietnam. The patrols were small, 4 to 6 men at most. They moved without sound, without trace, without the logistical signature that conventional forces trailed behind them like smoke. They could operate for 10 days at a stretch in a country that swallowed larger units whole. They did not fight unless they had to. When they did fight, they fought with a precision that left no margin for error, because in a jungle that close, and that dark, error was simply another word for death. The Viet Cong came to know them by a name that needs no translation. Ma Rong, forest devils, phantoms of the jungle. It was not a name born of theater. It was born of genuine, documented fear. Viet Cong intelligence reports from the period, captured and translated by Allied forces, contained specific warnings. Retreat when encountering Australian patrols. Disengage. Do not pursue. The SASR's kill and capture ratio across that campaign reached 164 to 1, not a ratio that invites easy comparison, not a number that belongs in the same conversation as conventional military statistics, a ratio that belongs to a different category of warfare entirely, one built not on firepower or mass, but on silence, patience, and the absolute willingness to hold discipline past the point at which most soldiers would break. Decades later, that tradition sat in the cellular memory of every operator who stepped off a transport aircraft into the Afghan night. They were not simply soldiers. They were the institutional descendants of a particular and very specific way of doing war. And the United States military, for all its extraordinary capability, had almost no framework for understanding it. By September 2001, that gap in understanding did not yet matter. The world had just changed. 19 men with box cutters and a clear understanding of asymmetric terror had destroyed 2 towers, carved a burning hole into the Pentagon, and killed close to 3,000 people on a single September morning. The shock was total. The response was inevitable. Within days, the United States was reaching for every instrument it possessed. Australia reached back. And what Australia did next was unprecedented in 50 years of alliance history. The ANZUS Treaty, signed in 1951, had never once in its entire existence been formally invoked. Not during Korea, not during Vietnam, not during any of the proxy conflicts that had rippled through the Cold War decades. It had been a promise, long dormant, waiting. On the 14th of September 2001, 3 days after the attacks, Australia invoked Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty for the first, and to this day, only time. An attack on the United States would be treated as an attack on Australia. The Australians were coming. They were coming without reservation. They were coming to fight, but getting to the fight was not as simple as the treaty made it sound. The task force had no pre-existing base in the Middle East. It had no automatic logistics chain, no guaranteed access to American command infrastructure, no seat at the table that nations with greater physical proximity to the theater might have expected to claim. Nothing was offered. Nothing was assumed. Every clearance, every basing arrangement, every command and control sponsorship had to be negotiated from scratch, and not all of the negotiations were friendly. Other coalition partners were positioning themselves within their own national agendas. There were follow-up discussions between the Australian Prime Minister and the American President before the most basic logistical questions were resolved. The relationship that Australians had assumed was automatic. The deep alliance built on a century of shared sacrifice from the Western Front to the Pacific to the Korean Peninsula turned out to require work at the most granular tactical level. The man who finally opened the door was Brigadier General James Mattis, a U.S. Marine officer of unsentimental and formidable clarity. Mattis agreed to provide command sponsorship for the Australian task force. Under Mattis, the Australians would have their chain of command, their access, and their purpose. Mattis himself would later rise to become the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, and eventually the United States Secretary of Defense. In late 2001, in the dust of Kandahar, he simply recognized soldiers who knew what they were doing and gave them room to do it. The 1st SASR squadron moved through Rhino and into Kandahar as the city fell in December. Their base shifted to Kandahar airfield. But the base was never the point. The base was the place you returned to. The work was outside it, far outside it, in the long stretches of eastern and southern Afghanistan, where the Land Rover Parentus crawled through valleys that had chewed up invaders since Alexander of Macedon, where the cold descended at altitude into temperatures that made equipment fail and bodies seize, where the only reliable asset was the human being inside the uniform, and the discipline that human being carried inside himself. The patrols were long, very long, longer than the Americans were accustomed to, longer, truthfully, than most coalition special forces were willing to attempt. An SASR operator from the period would later describe the contrast with clinical honesty, the kind of honesty that soldiers earn the right to after enough miles of the right kind of terrain. American special forces, he observed, were extraordinary athletes, physically imposing, aggressive, superbly equipped. Some of them, he noted with the directness that defines the particular Australian relationship with understatement, appeared to have invested considerable pharmaceutical assistance in their physical development. They could perform at extraordinary intensity for short periods. A couple of days in the field, and the operational rhythm demanded resupply, extraction, and reset. The Australians went for weeks. That is not hyperbole. The first SASR patrol to operate without resupply lasted 7 days in Afghan mountains in the deep of winter, with no external support, no helicopter delivery, no cavalry. The British Special Air Service, operating in the same theater, managed 4 days under similar conditions before requiring resupply. The Australians were in the field when the British came home. The first patrol was 7 days. Later rotations pushed further. By the time 3 Squadron arrived in the spring of 2002, the patrols were generating intelligence products of such specific and granular detail. Photographs of weapons smuggled across the Pakistani border on a trailer towed by a red farm tractor, identified from a concealed position so far away the tractor appeared no larger than a fingernail, that even the operators of the British SAS, who had been doing this since North Africa, expressed something approaching stunned admiration. None of this impressed the American commanders in the early months. That is the part of the story that gets left out of the official commemorations, the part that survives only in the testimony of soldiers who were there and are willing to speak about it. In the main U.S. command center in Afghanistan, the Australian SAS task group occupied a specific position on the operational map. Every coalition partner had a symbol. The British had one. The Canadians had one. The Australians had a cutout picture of Steve Irwin. Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, the television wildlife presenter, the man who made his name wrestling reptiles in Queensland, with a grin so wide it seemed to contain a specific kind of national energy that other countries had no exact equivalent for. The operators learned about it informally, the way soldiers always learn the things that reveal what their commanders actually think of them. The image landed badly. Pretty disheartening, one trooper later said, with the quiet restraint of a man who had chosen understatement over the emotion the situation probably warranted. It was not simply an insult. It was a structural misunderstanding. The Americans were looking at the Australians and seeing a helpful regional ally, a team player, a partner who would fill gaps and hold flanks and be grateful for the invitation. They were not seeing, could not yet see, a force with 60 years of a very specific kind of doctrinal pedigree, a force that had been hunting the world's most adaptable guerrilla fighters through some of the world's most unforgiving terrain since before many of the U.S. commanders had entered military service. The intelligence chief of the Australian task force, a man who later spoke to Time magazine under the single name Adam, put the structural problem in plain language. The Americans, he said, could not comprehend the Australian ability to go into areas for protracted periods and perform strategic reconnaissance. It was not what they did. Their model was different. Go in for a day, sometimes two, execute. The mission, extract. The concept of an operator spending 7, 10, 14 days in a concealed position, building a comprehensive intelligence picture from patient and sustained observation, was genuinely outside the experiential framework of the officers managing the coalition effort. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was a specific kind of institutional blindness, the limitation of imagining that other forces operated the way your force operates, because your force is so large and so dominant that it sets the default definition of what special operations looks like. The frustration on the Australian side was real, and it accumulated. The SASR task force was assigned missions that failed to utilize its core capability. Blocking duties, perimeter security, tasks that any adequately trained light infantry unit could perform. The soldiers who had volunteered and trained and refined themselves specifically for long-range strategic reconnaissance found themselves standing guard at positions that didn't require their particular skill set. It was the military equivalent of asking a watchmaker to pound fence posts. The posts would get pounded, but the watchmaker would know, with every swing of the hammer, that this was not what he was forgot by approximately 4 months into the deployment. In the early weeks of 2002, the Australian contingent was preparing to pack up and leave, not in disgrace, not in anger, simply in the recognition that if the coalition was not going to use the force for what it was designed to do, there was limited justification for maintaining the deployment. The task force was a finite and costly asset. Its operators were too valuable to waste as static security elements in a dynamic and rapidly evolving theater of operations. Then the Americans began planning. Operation Anaconda. The Shah-i-Kot Valley sits in Ghazni province in the central eastern part of Afghanistan, a deep geological wound in the high country, ringed by ridges that rise to over 3,000 meters and dotted with cave systems and natural fortifications that military forces had used to control the surrounding terrain for centuries. By early 2002, a substantial al-Qaeda and Taliban force had withdrawn into the valley. American intelligence assessed the number at between 200 and 300 fighters. The actual number, when the operation commenced, was closer to 1,000. That discrepancy between what the technology said and what the terrain contained would cost lives. And it was a discrepancy that did not have to happen. The Australians had already been there, months before Anaconda was formally planned. SASR patrols had penetrated the Shah-i-Kot area and begun building an intelligence picture from manned observation posts. The reports came back specific, detailed, and troubling. There were more people in the valley than the satellite imagery suggested. The cave systems were active. The movement patterns indicated organization and preparation, not a force in retreat, but of force-setting conditions. The intelligence was the kind that only patient human eyes, positioned for days in a concealed location, can generate, the kind that no unmanned aerial vehicle, no matter how sophisticated, can replicate, because it requires not just observation, but interpretation. And interpretation requires the accumulation of pattern over time. The U.S. command ordered the Australian patrols out of the area. Specifically, they were ordered to withdraw for fear of compromise. American reconnaissance assets, manned and unmanned aircraft, would take over the surveillance task. And so the Australian patrols came out. The cave systems continued their business unobserved, and the aerial reconnaissance, flying fast and high and briefly, failed to identify significant portions of the enemy's defensive preparations. When the Australians subsequently proposed formal involvement in Anaconda, they brought a specific offer to the table: infiltrate SASR patrols into the valley at least 10 days before the assault commenced, establish observation posts, build a real-time, comprehensive intelligence picture, feed that picture directly into the planning process so that the 10th Mountain Division soldiers who would eventually air assault into the valley floor would know, not estimate, not model, not project from signals intelligence, would actually know where the enemy was, in what strength, and in what configuration. An American Special Forces major, designated in contemporary accounts simply as Jimmy, refused. The Americans had their own Special Forces teams going in. They would manage their own intelligence preparation on the battlefield. The Australians were assigned a blocking role. They would occupy a position on the perimeter and prevent enemy fighters from escaping through a designated corridor. It was a legitimate mission. It was not the mission the SASR was built for. It was not the mission that would change the outcome. The operation commenced on the 2nd of March 2002. In the pre-dawn darkness, American helicopters lifted elements of the 10th Mountain Division and other coalition forces into the valley. And almost immediately, things went wrong. The enemy was not where the intelligence had placed them. The enemy was everywhere, in prepared positions on the high ground, in caves overlooking the landing zones, in fortified fighting positions. That the aerial reconnaissance had not identified, and that the brief infiltration of American Special Forces teams, inserted only a few days before the assault, had not had sufficient time to locate. The coalition soldiers who came in by helicopter found themselves in a valley. It was not the valley the briefings had described. Among the troops inserted into this initial chaos were 2 Australian soldiers serving as liaison officers attached to an American unit. They were not there in an SASR capacity. They were there as connectors between the coalition command structure and the Australian task force, but they were SASR operators, which meant they came with a specific discipline set. When the enemy fire intensified and the situation on the ground began to deteriorate rapidly, the American soldiers in the immediate vicinity made the decision to drop their heavy packs. And they dropped their radios with them. Soldiers under fire drop what slows them down. It is not a failure of will. It is the oldest human calculation: weight versus movement versus survival. When the bullets are close and the ground is open and the ridgeline above you is occupied by people are trying to kill you, every kilogram becomes a question. The Americans made the calculation that their radios, their heavy packs, were the answer to the question. They went down. The Australian liaison officers kept theirs. It was a decision that seemed small. It was a decision that opened the single most important communication channel of the battle's opening phase. Because the unit that had been pinned down was no longer able to communicate with anyone above battalion level. The coordination that the battle plan depended upon, the coordination between the ground forces in the valley and the air assets orbiting above, the attack helicopters and fast movers waiting for targeting data, had gone silent. And the 2 Australians, carrying the weight that the Americans had put down, were the ones who reopened it. They transmitted the position of the pinned unit. They transmitted the coordinates of the enemy firing positions. They called in this reporting that allowed headquarters to understand what was happening in the valley and begin the process of directing the assets, that could change the situation. The radio. A piece of equipment that every soldier on that battlefield carried into the valley. A piece of equipment that the weight of contact, the adrenaline of survival, and the rational pressure of physical economy had caused others to abandon. The Australians kept it because they had been trained in a doctrine that treated the radio not as a luxury, but as the one tool that tied the patrol to everything, to purpose, to intelligence, to the ability to call down consequences on the enemy from a distance. To drop the radio was to become invisible in a different and more dangerous sense. It was to exist without context. And the SASR had been operating in contexts where visibility depended entirely on maintained communication for 60 years. But the radio, as significant as it was only the first act of what Anaconda revealed about the Australian capacity. The larger revelation was still 4 days away, deep in the eastern high country, above the Shah-i-Kot, well beyond the positions that most coalition forces had reached or were attempting to reach. An SASR patrol occupied a concealed observation post. They had moved into this position before the main assault. They were watching a particular ridgeline that the task force intelligence chief, Adam, had identified through a specific analytical process, a process that owed more to the study of military history than to signals intelligence or satellite imagery. Adam had read the accounts of earlier mountain battles in Afghanistan, the Soviet campaigns of the 1980s, the particular geography of the high country as it imposed itself on the movement of forces under pressure. He had asked a different question from the one the Americans were asking. Not where are the enemy now, but where will they go when things get difficult? Where will they route their most valuable people if the valley becomes untenable? What does the terrain demand of a force that is running? The answer pointed to a specific ridgeline, a specific corridor, and Adam placed a patrol there. 4 days into the operation, the patrol reported contact. Not a firefight, observation. From a concealed position more than 1,200 meters from the target, through optics in the thin, cold air of high altitude, the patrol was watching a group of men moving through the terrain below. The detail they reported was specific and alarming. The group wore Russian-patterned camouflage. Not the standard dress of the Taliban or the common fighter categories the coalition had been hunting, but the higher quality operational kit associated with experienced, professional-level operators. They wore black balaclavas. They carried sophisticated weapons, better than the average, and they were not moving randomly. They were escorting someone, a white-robed figure, an older man, a man who moved with the careful step of someone who understood that he was important enough to be carried if necessary. A cane in his hand, men positioned around him in the specific geometry of close personal protection. The intelligence passed. Up the chain, the American intelligence apparatus examined it, and the assessment that came back was one that caused the planning operation to accelerate at a pace that reflected genuine high-level urgency. U.S. intelligence believed in the initial, hours following the report, that the SASR patrol might have located Osama bin Laden himself. The man in white, at altitude, guarded by men in Russian camouflage, fleeing the valley as the battle closed around it. A strike asset was directed to the position. A jet was called. A 500-kilogram bomb was released. It struck more than 100 meters from the target group, over a creek bed, well wide of the escaping figures. Follow-up strikes by a 10 Warthog aircraft killed a number of al-Qaeda fighters in the surrounding area. But the central figure, the white-robed man with the cane, was gone. The bomb had missed. The window had closed. The valley that had briefly contained something of extraordinary strategic value had exhaled it into the Pakistani border mountains before the full weight of American firepower could be brought to bear. The debate about who the white-robed man was has never fully closed. The task force intelligence chief, Adam, assessed on balance that the figure was Tor Yuldashov, the head of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, a senior al-Qaeda-linked commander of extensive experience and operational significance. A subsequent account by respected U.S. Army Times journalist Sean Naylor suggested the target was Ayman al-Zawahiri himself, Osama bin Laden's personal physician, his second-in-command, the operational brain behind the September 11th attacks. The overall American commander of Anaconda, Major General Franklin Hagenbeck, told Time magazine years later that he believed the target had been destroyed. The intelligence record does not confirm that assessment. What the intelligence record does confirm is this: a patrol of Australian soldiers, positioned by a specific analytical act of historical imagination at the precise point on the precise ridgeline through which the target was attempting to escape, achieved in 4 days what? The entire combined intelligence apparatus of the most powerful military in human history, the satellites, the unmanned aerial vehicles, the signals intelligence collection, the thousands of special forces operators and intelligence professionals had failed to achieve. The Australians had found the target. They had called the strike. The geometry was wrong, and the figure escaped. But the finding had been real, and the finding had been done by 6 men in a hole in a mountain, carrying their radios. The effect on the American perception of the SASR was immediate and irreversible. Before Anaconda, the Australians had been represented on a command map by a television celebrity. After Anaconda, they had flags tracked at the headquarters of U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida, briefed to the highest levels of the American military and political leadership. The intelligence they generated was described by American assessors as highly regarded. The specific and uncommon patience with which they held their observation posts, days, not hours, was producing intelligence products that the technological apparatus could not replicate. And the fact that 2 of their liaison officers had, in the first hours of the bloodiest day of the campaign, kept their radios when American soldiers had dropped theirs, that fact had entered the institutional memory of the coalition in the specific and irreversible way that simple physical acts do when they have consequences that everyone can see. The Americans lobbied for the Australians to stay. This was not a formality. It was a substantive political and military request, communicated at the highest levels of the coalition command and through direct communication between American and Australian senior leadership. The Australian government, which had been considering ending the deployment at the conclusion of 1 squadron's rotation, was persuaded by the specific weight of the Anaconda outcome. A 2nd squadron was deployed. The commitment continued. When 1 squadron began moving its equipment toward the transport aircraft that would take it home, 3 squadron arrived to take its place. And the departing soldiers, with the specific and irreducible humor of the Australian military character, received a farewell that no formal ceremony could have produced. As the veterans of 1 squadron walked out of the hangar toward the waiting aircraft, the fresh operators of 3 squadron lined up and dropped their trousers. The entire squadron, in formation, mooned the departing soldiers. The hangar echoed. The veterans, who had spent months fighting for the right to be taken seriously by the most powerful military machine on earth, responded with the kind of laughter that only people who have genuinely earned the right to it can produce. It was, as one former trooper later described it simply, 3 squadron arriving in good spirits. The operational contributions of subsequent rotations confirmed and extended the Anaconda precedent. 3 squadrons' patrols pushed further and lasted longer than anything 1 squadron had attempted, not because they were better soldiers, but because the conditions had changed. The commanding officers now had real access to the planning table. The Australians were no longer assigned blocking roles. They were asked to do what they had come to do: penetrate, observe, report, erect, and disappear. The intelligence they produced was remarkable in its specificity. The weapons trafficking report, photographs capturing the detail of a smuggling operation from a concealed position of such distance that the vehicle involved appeared barely visible. That single intelligence product was passed around American headquarters with the kind of astonishment that professionals reserve for work that exceeds their own expectations of what is possible. The British SAS, operating in the same theater and accustomed to measuring their own standard against the highest available benchmark, were, according to a trooper present, stunned. The Australians were managing 7 on the first patrol. In subsequent rotations, the duration extended further. The Australian capacity for sustained, silent, patient, self-sufficient penetration of denied territory was not a performance for coalition consumption. It was simply what they had been trained to do, what their history had built them to do, and what the terrain demanded from anyone who wanted to understand it, rather than simply occupy it. And this is the place where the specific weight of that battered military radio returns. Because the radio is not just a radio. It is a symbol that contains the entire argument, made the distinction visible that all the briefings and all the command map discussions and all the doctrinal papers had failed to convey. Every soldier in the Shah-i-Kot Valley carried a radio into the fight. The radio was standard equipment. It was on the manifest. It was part of the load. And under contact, under the specific and overwhelming pressure of fire from prepared positions on high ground, it was not cowardice. It was not incompetence. It was the response of professional soldiers operating within the instinctive framework their training had built them for. Manage the immediate, survive the contact, call in support when you can re-establish it. The Australians did not make that calculation. They made a different one. A calculation built on a doctrine that said the radio was not equipment. The radio was the mission. The radio was the thread that connected the patrol to the intelligence chain, the fire support system, the command picture that turned individual observation into collective consequence. To drop the radio was to cease to function as what they were. And an SASR operator who has ceased to function as what he is has made the most catastrophic error available to him. The weight was significant. The fire was real. The radio stayed. On the back, that distinction, that specific, physical, irreducible act of carrying what everyone else put down, translated directly into the ability to call in the reporting that changed the first day of Anaconda's fighting. And it translated, 4 days later, into the positioning of a patrol on a ridgeline identified not by satellite or signals intelligence, but by the reading of history, the asking of a different question, and the willingness to sit in the cold of a mountain hide for days without any guarantee of what might come through the sights. The awards that followed Anaconda were commensurate with the achievement. A Distinguished Service Cross was awarded to an SASR Sergeant Patrol Commander for actions during the operation. A United States Silver Star, the American military's third highest personal decoration for valor in combat, was awarded to a United States Air Force Forward Air Controller attached to one of the SASR patrols. A man from a different nation, embedded within the Australian force, recognized by his own country's highest conventions of military honor for what he witnessed and participated in while serving alongside the Australians in those mountains. The awards were not ceremonial. They were specific. They named specific actions. They named the thing that had been done, but the most significant award the SASR received from Anaconda was not made of metal. It was the seat at the table, the access to the planning process, the shift from a formation represented by a cartoon celebrity to a formation tracked by flags at the geographic heart of American military power. The shift from "you'll take the blocking role" to "what do you think we should do here?" That shift, the movement from peripheral utility to central partnership, was the award that actually mattered, which is the kind of irony that only military history produces with any regularity. is that the Australians had been trying to give this outcome to the Americans for months. They had proposed the early infiltration. They had offered the extended observation. They had explained, in the patient and specific language of soldiers who have done the thing they are describing, that the valley was more occupied than the US. Satellite imagery showed, and that the only way to know what was actually there was to put human eyes on it for long enough to see the pattern. The offer had been refused. The technological substitute had been tried. The technological substitute had produced an incomplete picture, and the incomplete picture had contributed to the conditions that made the first hours of Anaconda as costly as they were. That is not an indictment of the American military. It is an observation about the limits of any institutional framework, even the most powerful, most resourced, most technologically sophisticated institutional framework in this history of human warfare, when it encounters a problem that its own framework has not prepared it to recognize. The Americans were not blind to the value of human intelligence. They were operating within a model that had a specific temporal rhythm, a specific relationship between infiltration and action, a specific trust in the ability of technology to substitute for the sustained presence of human observers. That model had served them well in many contexts. In the Shah-i-Kot, in the deep winter of 2002, a model built in the jungles of Vietnam by men who had no technological substitute available and had therefore constructed a doctrine of patience and presence so refined that it had become, over decades, the essential identity of the force. 6. Men in a hole on a mountain for a week, eyes on the ground. The ability to read terrain, movement, and pattern into a coherent intelligence picture, and transmit that picture up the chain without losing the thread. It was not a superior model in every context. In the specific context of the Afghan high country in early 2002, it was the only model that was producing the information the coalition needed to fight the war it was actually in. There is a moment in every military alliance when the relationship between the partners changes register, when the polite and cooperative professional distance of allied forces operating in proximity gives way to something more direct and honest, the specific, unsentimental recognition that the person beside you can do things you cannot, and that this is not a slight against your own capability, but simply the fact that different formations, built from different traditions, carry different gifts. The relationship between the American and Australian Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan passed through that moment somewhere in the March cold of 2002. It took a valley, a botched assault, 2 liaison officers who kept their radios, and a patrol on a mountain that found what the satellites couldn't dot. It is worth pausing here to consider the longer arc of what the SASR brought to Afghanistan, because the arc does not begin in 2001. It begins in the jungles of Vietnam in 1966, where 6-man patrols moved through terrain that consumed conventional forces and earned a name from the enemy. That was the most accurate description available of what they were: forest devils, phantoms, creatures of a different category. The Viet Cong intelligence reports that described the SASR as the most feared allied force in the country did not use that language to be poetic. They used it because they had, over years of contact, lost too many people to understand that encounters with these specific soldiers operated by different rules than encounters with any other unit in the theater. The 164 to 1 kill and capture ratio that the regiment accumulated across those years did not represent a tactical miracle. It represented the accumulated consequence of a doctrine so precisely calibrated to its environment that it produced outcomes which, measured against conventional military metrics, appeared impossible. Arrived in Afghanistan in December 2001, the environment was different. The mountains of the Hindu Kush are not the jungles of Phuoc Tu province. The enemy was different. Al-Qaeda's global network bore no immediate operational resemblance to the Viet Cong's provincial insurgency structure. The technology had changed, the communications had changed, the weaponry had changed in ways that would have been literally unimaginable to the soldiers to occupy denied terrain for extended periods and build an intelligence picture from sustained observation rather than brief technological contact had not changed. Could not change because it was not a technique. It was a philosophy. And philosophies do not become obsolete when the technology around them advances. They either remain true or they do not, and the SAR's philosophy had proven true in circumstances too varied and too extreme to dismiss. The United States, in the early months of 2002, was confronting the specific limits of a different philosophy, the philosophy of mass and technology, and the substitution of computational power for human presence. It was a philosophy that had produced extraordinary military capability. It had also produced, in the specific context of the Afghan mountains, a gap between what the technology said was true and what the terrain actually contained. That gap cost lives at the opening of Operation Anaconda. It cost time. It may have cost the coalition its best opportunity to remove al-Qaeda's senior leadership in a single decisive operation. The Australians had not caused that gap. They had tried to close it. They had offered months before the battle the sustained human presence in the terrain that would have produced the intelligence picture that might have changed the outcome. And when the battle went wrong, in the ways that the gap had made inevitable, it was the Australians, with their radios on their backs and their patrols in the mountain hides, who began. The process of recovering the situation. History does not always distribute its credits fairly. The SASR's role in Operation Anaconda was classified for years after the event. The detailed accounts that have since emerged came primarily from soldiers willing to speak without attribution, from intelligence officers who believed the record deserved correction, and from journalists patient enough to find them. The official commemoration of the battle centered understandably on the American formations that bore the majority of the casualties. The two Australians who kept their radios do not appear in the standard narrative of what happened on the first day. The patrol that identified the white-robed figure on the ridgeline does not appear in most accounts of what Anaconda achieved or failed to achieve. The record was classified. The names were withheld. The flags on the CENTCOM map told the story, only to those who had clearance to read it. But the story has a shape that classification cannot entirely conceal. Because the consequences were real and observable, a seat at the planning table was given and maintained. Awards were presented: a Distinguished Service Cross, a U.S. Silver Star, for actions that the citations could describe only in the most general operational language, but that the recipients and the commanders who awarded them understood with complete specificity. The shape of those consequences tells the story of what the SASR had done and what the Alliance had learned. The radio sits at the center of that shape. It is not a grand object. It is not beautiful. Heavy, rubberized, worn at the back of an operator who was already carrying more than a rational calculation of load would recommend. It was kept when the rational calculation of load had caused others to let it fall. It was kept because the doctrine that had been built over 60 years of operating in denied terrain had made the radio not a piece of equipment, but an extension of purpose. And purpose, when it has been genuinely internalized, not as an instruction, but as identity, does not go down even when the weight is extreme, and the fire is close, and the valley is full of everything that wants to stop you. In the final assessment, what the SASR did in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002 was not a tactical miracle. It was something more ordinary and more profound. It was the application of a way of doing things, a specific, patient, accumulated, historically grounded way of doing things, to a context that desperately needed it. The most powerful military on Earth had the satellites. It had an unmanned aircraft. It had the signals intelligence and the computational capacity and the logistical machine that could sustain a force of thousands at the far end of the world for years without resupply. What it did not have, in those specific mountains in those specific early months, was 6 men willing to sit in the cold for a week with their radios on their backs and their eyes on the ridgeline where the white-robed man with the cane was walking. The Australians had that. They had always had that. And when the moment came that required it, they carried it forward through the dark and the cold and the weight, the way they had carried it forward through the jungles of Vietnam and the training grounds of Campbell. Barracks and the accumulated decades of a philosophy that said, simply and without decoration, go further than anyone else is willing to go. Stay longer than anyone else is willing to stay. Carry what everyone else has put down. And when the white-robed figure appears in the sights at 1,200 meters, send the report up the chain with the clarity and precision that the weeks of patience and the weight of the radio on your back have made possible. The SASR's intelligence. Chief Adam gradually, correctly understood. The Americans, he said, couldn't comprehend that a force could go into areas for protracted times to do strategic roles. It wasn't what they did. And then, after Anaconda, after the radios, after the mountain hide and the white-robed figure and the 500-kilogram bomb that missed by 100 meters over a creek bed, after all of that, the Americans understood something they had not understood before. Not everything that matters on a battlefield can be measured in megawatts of processing power, or tons of ordnance, or some things can only be measured in days of patience and the willingness to carry what everyone else put down. The flags on the CENTCOM map stayed up. The commitment continued. And when 3 squadron arrived to replace 1, squadron and the departing operators walked through the hangar toward the transport that would take them home. The fresh soldiers who had come to continue the mission gave them the only farewell. That seemed adequate to the occasion, not ceremony, not commendation. A mooning, full, unapologetic, conducted with the specific and irreducible enthusiasm of soldiers who had arrived in good spirits and intended to remain that way regardless of what the mountains ahead of them contained. It was, in its own way, the most Australian thing that happened in the entire deployment. And the men who received it, who had found the target at 1,200 meters, who had kept the radio when the fire was close, who had pushed the British SAS to stunned admiration with 7 days in the field without resupply, laughed. The way people laugh when they have genuinely earned the right to the joke. They carried their radios into Afghanistan. They came home carrying their medals. And between those two facts, in the cold and the dark, and the patience of the Hindu Kush,